Even when life throws us into the unknown, Sir Veteran fights to keep his loyal dog, but what the dog does in the courtroom leaves everyone absolutely stunned. The fluorescent lights of the city courthouse flickered faintly as Jackson Don Cheadle wheeled himself into the grand hall. Cameras flashed like lightning strikes, their cold bursts illuminating the medals pinned to his worn military jacket. Reporters crowded the marble steps, microphones raised, voices demanding sound bites that Jackson ignored. Beside him, Laika, his German Shepherd service dog, padded silently, her calm demeanor belying the intensity in her alert eyes. Inside the courtroom, murmurs rippled as Jackson took his place at the defendant's table. His decorated uniform drew quiet awe from the spectators, but the weight of the room's attention made his hands tremble on the armrests of his wheelchair. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room quieted as the judge entered. Jackson glanced briefly at the stern woman in robes who now held the fate of his only family in her hands. Leaning forward, Jackson adjusted his microphone. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thick with restrained emotion, "Laika isn't just a dog. She's my partner, my savior, and the reason I'm alive today. On the battlefield, when everything around me was chaos, she was my constant. She warned me of IEDs, kept me grounded, and pulled me out of the rubble when I was injured." Jackson paused, gripping the edges of his chair tightly. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words lingering like a fog. "After the war, I wasn't the same man. I struggled with nightmares, panic attacks, and the feeling that I had no purpose. Like her, she brought me back. She reminded me to live. And now you're asking me to let her go, to treat her as a mere asset of the government. She's not a weapon or a piece of equipment. She's family." A sniffle broke the silence in the gallery, a woman dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Others shifted uncomfortably, clearly moved but unsure where to direct their sympathies. "Your Honor," Jackson continued, his voice cracking, "if you take her from me, you're not just taking my service dog, you're taking my lifeline." The judge's expression remained unreadable as she leaned back, hands folded neatly on the bench. Murmurs rose among the audience. Suddenly, a man stood, his weathered face and close-cropped hair marked him as a fellow veteran. "This is wrong," he said, his voice firm and resonant. "You sit here sipping lattes and debating paperwork while men like Jackson bleed for this country." He gestured toward Jackson. He's earned the right to keep Laika, not because of some technicality, but because of what he sacrificed. Applause erupted, but the judge banged her gavel sharply. "Order," she commanded. "I will not tolerate disruptions in my courtroom." As the noise subsided, Jackson reached down to touch Laika's head, his fingers brushing her soft fur. "Easy, girl," he whispered. But Laika didn't relax. Her ears were erect, her body tense, and her eyes locked onto the judge. Jackson's voice wavered. Without warning, Laika lunged forward, snapping the leash from Jackson's hand. She barked ferociously, her deep voice echoing off the wooden walls. Gasps filled the room. The judge froze, gavel poised mid-air. "Control your dog," she demanded, her tone laced with panic. Jackson wheeled himself forward, his heart pounding. "Heel," he commanded, but the dog didn't relent. "Your Honor," Jackson said, his voice trembling, "she's not attacking. She's warning us." A man in the gallery scoffed, "It's just a dog, for crying out loud." Jackson turned sharply. "She's not just a dog. She's trained to detect danger, explosives, threats, things you can't see. If she's reacting like this, there's a reason." The judge hesitated, clearly torn between authority and the growing unease in the room. Laika's barking intensified, her body rigid as she stared unblinking at the bench. "Listen to her," Jackson pleaded. "I've seen this before on the battlefield. Every time she reacted like this, lives were at stake." The atmosphere thickened with tension. A low hum of whispers spread among the crowd. Some leaned toward the exits, others watching Laika with wide-eyed apprehension. A bailiff approached cautiously, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Sir, I'll need to restrain the dog." "No," Jackson barked. "You don't understand. Laika's trying to protect us." The judge's gavel slammed down, but it didn't silence the room. Laika's barking was relentless. her every muscle taut as though bracing for an unseen impact. Jackson's voice dropped, barely audible over the chaos. "Please, Your Honor, trust her." For a moment, the judge seemed to waver. Then, she gestured to the bailiff. "Clear the room." The decision sparked a flurry of movement. Reporters scrambled to grab their equipment. Spectators murmured anxiously as they filed out. Jackson remained seated, his hand on Laker's head, murmuring reassurances even as his own fear mounted. Laker's barking stopped as suddenly as it began, replaced by a low growl. The silence was deafening, broken only by the echo of footsteps fading into the corridor. Jackson turned to the judge, his eyes locked with hers. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "just know she's never been wrong." The murmurs died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence as Jackson's words sank in. Unease spread through the courtroom, the atmosphere shifting to something darker, heavier. Then, without warning, Laker stopped barking. The sudden quiet was deafening, making every breath, every rustle in the room seem amplified. Laker's body became completely still, her head snapping toward the far end of the courtroom. Her ears shot up, and a low, menacing growl rumbled deep in her chest. The abrupt change was so intense that even the judge froze mid-motion. All eyes turned to the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. The unease in the crowd deepened. Whispers of panic replaced nervous chatter as heads swiveled, trying to see what Laker was locked onto. Jackson's breathing quickened. He followed Laker's gaze, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The scene was unnervingly familiar. He had witnessed this exact behavior on the battlefield moments before Laker unearthed a hidden explosive or signaled an imminent attack. "Laker," Jackson whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of tension. "What is it?" Laker didn't budge. Her entire body remained rigid. Her growl deepened, resonating through the room like a warning bell. It wasn't just a threat to Jackson anymore. Whatever Laker sensed, it could endanger everyone present. The sound of Laker's growl reverberated through the courtroom, low and steady like distant thunder. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Every pair of eyes fixed on the dog, his body coiled with purpose, his gaze unyielding on the imposing double doors. Even the judge, who moments ago had been stern and dismissive, now looked visibly shaken. Her gavel hovered in her hand, forgotten as she exchanged uneasy glances with the bailiff stationed nearby. The air was electric, thick with tension, so palpable it felt alive. Jackson's breaths came faster now, shallow and quick. His fingers dug into the armrests of his wheelchair, bracing for something he couldn't yet see. This wasn't paranoia or chance. Laker's instincts had saved lives before. Jackson clenched his jaw. "Stay calm, everyone, stay calm." But no one moved. All attention remained locked on Laker, whose growl grew deeper, vibrating through the heavy silence. Whatever she was warning them about, it wasn't distant. It was here. It was imminent. Danger was imminent. That much was clear. Jackson tried to steady his nerves, repeating to himself, "Stay calm." But the reassurance felt empty, even to him. The bailiffs, frozen by uncertainty, lingered near the judge's bench. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with wary eyes, finally stepped forward. His hand hovered over the holster on his hip as he muttered, "It's just a dog, right? Probably reacting to the noise or all these people." His voice, however, carried an undertone of doubt. Despite his words, his movements were careful, almost measured. Jackson shook his head firmly, raising his voice just enough to cut through the murmurs rippling across the courtroom. "No. Laker doesn't react to noise or crowds like this. She's trained to sense danger. Things we can't see. If she's acting like this, always the potential for growth, for love, and for a happiness we never saw coming. It means something seriously wrong." For a moment, the tension in the room was palpable, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap. The judge, visibly rattled, glanced from Laker to the bailiffs before giving a small nod, signaling them to check the door. Laker's growls intensified as the BFFs approached the heavy wooden door. The larger man hesitated, his fingers curling around the cold metal handle. The room collectively held its breath. Jackson sat forward in his wheelchair, his chest tightening as Laker's growls transitioned into sharp, urgent barks. The bailiff began to push the door open, the creak of the hinges cutting through the oppressive silence. Beyond the doorway, a dark hallway stretched into an eerie stillness. At first, it appeared empty, but Laker's barking grew louder. His sharp eyes, laser-focused on something invisible to everyone else. The larger BFF stepped cautiously into the hallway, his grip tightening on his holstered weapon. He turned back toward the courtroom briefly, his face pale and uncertain. When he faced forward again, his voice cracked the silence. "There's something out here." Jackson's heart thudded in his chest, each beat heavy with anticipation. His eyes darted between Laker and the bailiff, dread coiling in his stomach. Laker's instincts had never been wrong before. Whatever was out there, it was real. The courtroom seemed to grow colder, the air thickening as if it were charged with static. Laker's bark ricocheted off the wooden walls, each sound reverberating like a warning bell. His body was a coiled spring, muscles taut, head low, and ears pinned forward. His growls morphed into an urgent rhythm, each bark sharper than the last. The larger bailiff hesitated, his boots clicking against the tiled floor as he edged further into the shadows. "What's happening out there?" the judge demanded, his voice cracking despite his attempt to project. Orlee's knuckles whitened as he gripped the gavel, his eyes darting anxiously between Laker and the open door. The dog's low, guttural growl rumbled through the room like distant thunder, sending a shiver down every spine. The bailiff glanced back toward the courtroom, his face drawn tight with apprehension. "I don't see anything," he said, his voice laced with unease. Yet, as his words echoed into the silence, Laker's body remained locked in hyper-alertness. The courtroom audience shifted uneasily in their seats, the heavy atmosphere pressing down on them. Jackson's jaw tightened. He could feel it. Something was out there, lurking just beyond their sight. Laker, however, wasn't convinced. The German shepherd's growls deepened, his barks growing more urgent as he strained against the leash, nearly pulling it free from Jackson's hand. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang echoed down the corridor. The sound rang clear and jarring, shattering the silence. The smaller bailiff flinched, his flashlight beam jerking erratically as he instinctively stepped back. Laker lunged toward the noise, barking furiously, his claws scraping against the tile as he fought against Jackson's grip. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, panic spreading like wildfire. The larger bailiff reacted instinctively, drawing his firearm. What the hell was that? Jackson's heart pounded, the weight of certainty pressing on his chest. Raising his voice above the growing chaos, he shouted, "Get Laker back!" His tone was edged with fear and an unwavering conviction. He's never wrong. Something's coming. Another metallic clang reverberated through the hallway, this time louder, sharper, as if the source of the sound was drawing closer. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with a sense of imminent danger. Laker's barking intensified, his body taut with tension. Every muscle strained toward the hallway as if he could force his way through sheer willpower. Jackson clutched the leash tightly, his knuckles white, his pulse thundering in his ears. Whatever Laker had detected was no longer a distant threat. It was near, tangible, unavoidable. The larger BFF stepped cautiously into the hallway, his gun raised, his eyes scanning every shadow in the dimly lit corridor. His partner followed hesitantly, the flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam sliced through the darkness, but the hallway remained eerily empty, silent, still. Yet, Laker's urgency didn't falter. His growls grew deeper, more insistent, his body vibrating with a primal intensity. Jackson wanted to scream for an evacuation, to demand immediate action, but his gaze swept the room, catching the paralyzed expressions of the crowd. No one was moving. The metallic clang rang out again, closer, its sharp edge cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. The atmosphere in the room became unbearable, charged with a sense of foreboding so thick it was almost tangible. Laker's barking grew frenzied, his claws skidding against the floor as he lunged against the leash. Jackson could feel the tension vibrating through his hand, as though the dog's panic had become his own. His instincts screamed that this was no false alarm. The larger bailiff pressed further into the hallway, his weapon steady despite the growing tension. His partner lingered just behind, the flashlight's unsteady beam casting eerie shadows against the walls. The corridor remained empty, offering no clues, no signs of movement. But Laker's reaction left no room for doubt. Jackson's jaw clenched as he glanced toward the judge, her face pale and rigid, and then back to the trembling crowd. Every fiber of his being urged him to act, to force the room into motion. But he was too late. The next metallic clang came louder than before, almost deafening, a sound that carried the weight of an imminent reckoning. "Do you see anything?" the judge called out, his voice cracking as he leaned forward in his chair. The gavel in his hand wavered slightly, his usual commanding presence replaced with an undeniable trace of fear. The taller bailiff turned briefly, his face pale and damp with sweat. "Not yet," he murmured, his tone low and tight as though speaking too loudly might provoke whatever was out there. "But something feels off." His boots echoed against the polished floor as he stepped cautiously forward, the sound amplifying the tension in the room. The courtroom buzzed with anxious whispers. Spectators clutched their belongings tightly, some edging toward the doors. Their fear spread rapidly through the crowd. Jackson shifted his wheelchair forward, his focus sharp on Laker, who had gone unnervingly still. Laker's ears were pinned forward, his body frozen like a coiled spring. His eyes were fixed on the open doorway, locked onto something. Jackson said, his voice uneven, "I don't know what it is, but it's out there." Just as the taller bailiff reached the halfway point of the hall, a shadow flickered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the smaller bailiff stumble. His flashlight beam jerked wildly across the walls. "There!" he cried, his voice rising with panic. The taller bailiff halted, his firearm snapping upward, trained on the darkness. Laker exploded into frantic barking, his powerful lunge against the leash nearly pulling it free from Jackson's grasp. "Back up!" Jackson yelled, his voice cutting through the rising noise. "Get out of there!" The judge banged the gavel furiously, trying to restore order, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos. Spectators were on their feet now, the hum of murmurs escalating into shouts. Then, from the dim hallway, a sound emerged, slow, deliberate footsteps. Each step was heavy, measured, and unhurried, like whoever or whatever was approaching wanted to be heard. Laker's barks morphed into guttural snarls. His teeth bared, his whole body pressing forward with an intensity that made Jackson's heart pound. Jackson's chest tightened as dread seeped into every fiber of his being. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide. It was coming straight toward them unapologetically. The footsteps grew louder, sharper, cutting through the panicked voices and the judge's futile attempts to restore order. Laker lunged against the leash with such force that Jackson had to grip his wheelchair's armrests to avoid being dragged forward. "Everybody stay calm," the judge shouted, slamming the gavel again. But the command fell flat. People were rising from their seats, clutching their bags and each other, grasping for anything solid as though it might shield them from the unknown threat. The taller bailiff stood like a statue, his gun aimed into the hallway, unwavering. Behind him, his partner's flashlight flitted nervously across the walls, chasing shadows but illuminating nothing substantial. Jackson's voice cut through, the commotion sharp and urgent. "Get out of there," he called, his tone laced with an edge that couldn't be ignored. "Whatever's coming, it's not safe." The taller bailiff didn't move, his hand steady on the trigger. His gaze locked on the creeping darkness. Laker's snarling grew louder, his body pulling relentlessly against the leash as if he could single-handedly confront whatever was approaching. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with fear and anticipation. Every eye was fixed on the hallway, the origin of the ominous footsteps that had everyone paralyzed. Another step echoed, this one louder, bolder, like a hammer striking the silence. The tension was unbearable. Jackson's grip tightened on Laker's leash. His mind raced, knowing all too well that when Laker reacted like this, danger wasn't far behind. "Please!" Jackson shouted again, his voice desperate. "Get back now!" The bailiff remained frozen, his silhouette stark against the dim hallway, as another step sounded closer, deliberate, unyielding. Laker's growls filled the room, matching the collective dread that no one dared voice aloud. Then the shadow shifted again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Its movements were deliberate, slow, and intentional. The smaller bailiff let out a shaky gasp, his flashlight quivering in his unsteady grip. "There's someone there," he stuttered, his voice barely audible. The beam of light briefly illuminated a figure, tall, imposing, before it vanished back into the darkness as quickly as it appeared. That fleeting glimpse was enough to send a palpable wave of unease rippling through the room. The larger bailiff tightened his hold on his sidearm. His voice measured but low. "Show yourself," he ordered.
"Step into the light where we can see you."
The only response was a suffocating silence that seemed to stretch endlessly, amplifying the already tense atmosphere.
Leica's barking intensified.
His powerful frame coiled tightly, ready to spring into action. His bared teeth glinted in the dim light. Then the moment came. The figure emerged slowly, stepping into the beam of the flashlight with an almost unnerving calm. It was a man, his features obscured by the shadow of a hood. His hands were buried in the deep pockets of a heavy coat. He moved with purpose, his demeanor oddly relaxed despite the disruption he had caused. Stopping just at the edge of the light, he tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the scene unfolding before him. Leica's growl deepened, feral and guttural, as his claws scraped against the floor. Jackson struggled to keep his grip on the leash, his arms trembling from the effort. "Who are you?" barked the large bailiff, his weapon trained on the man. The hooded figure didn't respond. Instead, he took another measured step forward, the faint trace of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, just visible beneath the shadows. Jackson felt his breath hitch as a wave of unease washed over him, a primal, unshakable sense that something was profoundly wrong.
The man raised his hands slowly.
The motion made both bailiffs stiffen, their fingers tightening on their triggers. "Relax," he said, his voice smooth, low, and disturbingly assured. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." But his tone, cold and calculated, seemed to chill the very air. Each word hung heavy, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. Jackson's instincts screamed otherwise, and he could tell Leica felt it too. The dog's growling had become a constant vibrating hum, the sound filling the tent-like courtroom. The larger bailiff's voice cracked slightly as he issued another order: "Move forward." Slowly, the man tilted his head again, his hood casting a shadow that concealed most of his face. Without breaking his unnerving composure, he took another step closer. The sound of his boots tapping against the polished floor echoed in the uneasy quiet. Every movement he made felt calculated and intentional, as though he were feeding off the anxiety now gripping the room. Leica lunged against his leash, barking furiously. His claws scraped the floor in a desperate attempt to close the distance. Jackson's hands slickened with sweat as he tightened his hold, straining to pull the dog back. The man stopped again, just out of reach of the trembling flashlight beam. His posture radiated an eerie confidence, as if he was fully aware of the power he wielded over the situation. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a man they were staring at, something far more dangerous than anyone in the room had prepared for. The smaller bailiff's flashlight flickered slightly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Jackson could hear the nervous breaths of the officers, their fear barely masked by their professional demeanor. Leica's growling deepened, resonating through the air like a warning siren no one could ignore. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the larger bailiff barked, his voice betraying a trace of unease despite his firm stance. The hooded man smiled faintly, the curve of his lips barely visible. He lifted his hands higher, his movements unhurried. His calmness was unnerving. "I told you," he said smoothly, "I'm not a threat." Jackson's chest tightened. The man's words didn't match his presence. Every fiber of Jackson's being screamed that this man was dangerous. Leica snarled again, louder this time, his muscles taut as he strained forward. The man took another deliberate step, his figure becoming clearer in the flickering light. His movements were methodical, as though he was savoring every second of the fear he was creating. Jackson's grip on the leash was slipping, his palms slick with sweat. "That's far enough," the larger bailiff shouted, his weapon still locked on the figure. But the man didn't stop. His next step clicked against the floor, steady and deliberate, suffocating the room with quiet creeping terror. Jackson muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "He knows. He can feel it.
Something's wrong."
Though his words were barely audible, The judge caught them and shot him a brief glance, his expression betraying a mix of fear and confusion. A younger bailiff stepped forward cautiously, a flashlight in one hand, the other hovering near his holster. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with nerves. "Identify yourself. Now." The man finally lifted his head. His face was partially obscured by the hood's shadow. His eyes were sharp and unnerving, cold. Their intensity sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man said, his voice unsettlingly calm and hollow. He moved a hand toward his pocket, and both bailiffs reacted immediately, weapons raised higher. Gasps rippled across the room, and someone in the back whispered, "He's got something." The air felt thick, like a storm about to break. Jackson's instincts screamed for him to act, but his body refused to move. His grip on Laker's leash tightened, his knuckles white as he tried to ground himself in the present. The stranger pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing a small metallic object. The bailiffs shouted in unison, "Drop it!" The man froze for a moment, then smirked faintly. "Relax," he said, his tone smooth and unnervingly confident. He held the object up, letting it catch the dim light. It was just a key, plain and unthreatening. But Jackson's gut told him there was more to this man than met the eye. Laker's barking remained unrelenting, a deep and guttural sound that filled the courtroom like a warning siren. Jackson whispered to himself, "It's not just a key."
"It can't be."
The man's smile widened, as if he could read Jackson's thoughts. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. All eyes locked on the man, who stood seemingly unfazed by the chaos around him. Laker growled louder, his body taut and straining against the leash. Every bark was a desperate plea for attention. Jackson's hand shook as he held on to Laker, his breath shallow. Something about this man felt wrong, like he wasn't just a danger, but the start of something much darker. "Drop the key and back away," the larger bailiff barked, his voice commanding but edged with unease. The younger bailiff edged closer, his flashlight unwavering, though his face was pale with tension. The man tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze drifting toward Laker. "That dog," he said in a low, conversational tone. "He's different, isn't he? Always one step ahead. Always knowing before anyone else. What makes him so special?" Jackson's stomach twisted. How does this man know about Laker? About his abilities, his instincts? The man's calm voice carried an eerie weight, and Jackson forced himself to respond. His voice was sharp but shaky. "How do you know that?"
Laker barked louder, lunging against the leash.
His movements frantic. Jackson strained to hold him back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The stranger's smirk deepened. His eyes glinted with a sinister edge as he slowly raised the key, his movements deliberate, almost mocking. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice dripping with certainty. With a chilling metallic click, he turned the key in his hand. The sound was faint but triggered an instant reaction.
Laker launched into an uncontrollable frenzy, barking louder than ever before.
The lights in the courtroom flickered erratically, plunging the space into a moment of complete darkness. In the pitch black, Jackson could hear gasps, panicked cries, and the sharp scrape of chairs as people scrambled in fear. When the lights flickered back on, the situation had escalated.
The stranger wasn't alone anymore.
Two figures had appeared behind him, stepping out of the hallway like specters, materializing from the shadows. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were deliberate, exuding a chilling sense of menace. Each figure carried a weapon, their metallic surfaces gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights, leaving no doubt about their lethal intent.
Jackson's pulse quickened.
His eyes darted to Laker, whose growl had deepened into something raw and primal. This wasn't just about a man with a demand anymore. This was something far more sinister.
Panic rippled through the courtroom like a wave.
Spectators shoved toward the exits, their shouts rising in chaotic discord. Chairs screeched across the floor as people fought to get away from the impending threat. The two figures moved farther into the room. Their mere presence intensified the atmosphere of dread. Laker barked incessantly, his body crouched low and tense. Every muscle coiled, as though ready to attack. Jackson's grip on the leash tightened, adrenaline surging through him. Jackson didn't need anyone to tell him the truth. He already felt it in his bones. The stranger wasn't bluffing. Laker was the reason they were there. "Everyone stay calm," the judge commanded, slamming his gavel. But his voice was barely audible over the escalating chaos. One of the bailiffs, a large man with a steady stance, stepped forward. His flashlight trained on the stranger. "Stop right there," he ordered firmly. The stranger, however, remained unfazed. He took another slow, deliberate step forward, his expression unnervingly composed. The two figures behind him mirrored his movements, amplifying the suffocating tension in the room. Then the stranger spoke, his voice cutting cleanly through the din. "No one needs to get hurt.
All I want is the dog."
Though his tone was calm, an undercurrent of malice sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. Laker growled low, his unwavering focus locked on the man, as though he understood every word. "You're not taking him," Jackson said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. He wheeled himself closer to Laker, his hand firm on the leash. "He's not just a dog. He's my partner. My family. I don't care who you are or what you think you have the right to do. You're not taking him." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, the weight of Jackson's words hanging in the air.
The stranger's smirk faded,
his expression hardening as he studied Jackson with a cold, calculating gaze. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, his voice cool but sharp. His eyes shifted back to Laker, frustration flashing briefly across his face. "He's special, you know that. But keeping him will only make things worse for you." Jackson clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the leash. "Laker stays with me," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for debate.
The crowd buzzed with whispers, a mix of fear and confusion swelling in the room.
Some pleaded for calm, while others speculated anxiously about what might happen next. Laker barked again, the sharp sound snapping everyone back to the present moment. His focus on the stranger was absolute, a tangible reminder of what was at stake. Jackson leaned forward in his chair, his chest tight with determination. He wasn't sure how this confrontation would end, but he knew one thing: Laker wasn't going anywhere. The courtroom was thick with unease. Every person frozen in place as the stranger stood still, his piercing gaze locked on Laker. The German shepherd's low growl reverberated like distant thunder, his stance tense and ready to act. Jackson tightened his grip on the leash, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. His eyes met the stranger's with unwavering resolve, a silent testament to the bond he shared with his loyal companion. Behind the man, his two associates remained motionless, their presence heavy, but no longer advancing. The air was thick with suspense, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the judge cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the crackle of tension in the room. "This disruption ends now. Officers, escort these men out immediately." His words carried authority, though there was a faint tremor beneath his composed exterior. The officers hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, their movements cautious. Laker responded instantly, letting out a sharp warning bark. His teeth flashed briefly, his unyielding focus fixed on the intruders. The stranger, unfazed, raised a hand in a deliberate, measured motion, signaling his companions to stand down. His expression shifted, not to anger, but something more unsettling, a calm, calculated resignation. "This isn't over," the man said, his voice eerily calm, but weighted with menace. "You think this is just about the dog, but it's far bigger than that.
You'll understand soon enough."
He stepped back, his smirk devoid of warmth, sharp with cold confidence. "For now, I'll go. But know this, he belongs to us."
"We'll be back."
Jackson's chest tightened, his fingers never relaxing on Laker's leash. His voice cut through the charged silence like steel. "He belongs to no one but me," he said firmly, his tone steady and unshakable. "And whatever you're after, you'll have to face both of us to get it." For the first time, the stranger faltered. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying Jackson as though trying to calculate his strength. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and motioned to his companions. They followed him without a word, retreating through the same doors they had entered. The tension didn't fully dissipate until the doors closed behind them. Whispers rippled through the room as spectators slowly settled back into their seats, their hushed voices buzzing with speculation. The judge exhaled audibly, placing his gavel on the bench with a trembling hand. "This court is adjourned," he announced, his voice weary and barely audible over the murmurs that filled the air. But Jackson didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the doors, his body still, taut with vigilance, sensing the danger hadn't passed. Finally, Laker sat down. His growls subsided, though his posture remained alert. Jackson reached down, his hand brushing lightly over the dog's head. "You did good, buddy," he murmured, his voice a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. As the courtroom emptied around him, Jackson stayed behind, his thoughts racing. Who was that man? And why did they want Laker? The questions swirled unanswered, but one thing was certain: this wasn't the end. For now, though, he let himself breathe. Laker leaned against his leg, the steady presence of the dog grounding him. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Because no matter what threats loomed ahead, their bond was unshakable. And that, Jackson knew, was something no one could take from them. Wow, what a powerful story of loyalty and resilience. Jackson and Laker's unbreakable bond reminds us that true partnerships can stand against any challenge. But what do you think is coming next for them? Will Nathan and Thor be able to protect each other from the mysterious threat? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
I'd love to hear what you think.
And if this story moved you as much as it did me, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.